Hello and welcome everyone to the sixth of our When HR Meets GDPR sessions. Today's topic is security clearance, something that Julie and I have been thinking of doing for quite some time, and finally we managed to get around it. So both Julie and I strongly believe in generating awareness and educating businesses in HR and GDPR, hence our LinkedIn Live. The reason for that is because one regulation deals with people while the other deals with data belonging to those people, personal data. So these two regulations, they collide at every turn. And that's the reason why we're here talking to you and sharing our knowledge and wisdom. Please submit your comments and questions. They are very, very welcome. They help us to identify topics to bring to the table for the future. If there is anything in particular that you would like us to cover, please do let us know. We do value your input. And throughout the session, please be aware that you can ask questions through the comments from LinkedIn. We will pick them up and answer them at the end, time permitting. If we do run out of time, we will come back to you afterwards. So let's get on with today's session about security clearance. Julie, would you like to introduce yourself for the purpose of those that perhaps have joined us for the first time?
Of course. Good morning, everyone. I'm Julie from Mercury Solutions. I'm a HR practitioner and also a coach and a chartered fellow of the CIPD. So in terms of the HR, I've had over 25 years working in the trade. So just a few weeks. I was counting it up the other day. I was just like, oh, this is not good. But I work with small and medium-sized businesses in order to empower the business through people solutions. Whether that's on a day-to-day basis, whether that's I drop in and support the team as a strategic partner. The solution is the aim for me. But I'm also a leadership and confidence coach. So working with leaders coming through or wanting to upskill themselves. Again, it's all about empowerment for me. As Christina said, it's knowledge is the key and transferring that awareness and information across. Christina, would you like to introduce yourself?
All right, if you pull my leg, yes. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Christina from CVG Solutions, and I am a multi-award winning GDPR or data protection, which I prefer, professional. I have over 30 years experience working with best practices, methodologies, frameworks, and then obviously more recently with data protection. I primarily work with small and medium-sized businesses, including charities, because I really like to see them thrive. And so I tend to gravitate towards them. My approach is practical and hands-on with my client, but also I change it and I adapt it to make it proportionate to their size and complexity. So whatever solutions it's implemented, it is appropriate for that business. And so basically, I help my clients navigate the intricacy of GDPR because it's complex, it's not a one-size-fits-all, it's not a tick-in-the-box exercise, it's not about numbers, it's very, very fluid. And I do that by educating them on the subject, which then actually empowers them to make informative decisions. As they say, knowledge is power. And that in turn, this enables them to operate with a high-performing culture, which fuels their business growth. So for me, it's all about educating, empowering, and enabling.
It's fantastic, isn't it, that we've got such similar aims for our businesses. So everyone, just before we begin, just to let you know, this session is going to be recorded so that we can use it for marketing purposes. So please be aware of that. We'll share content on our social media and websites as well.
Excellent. Okay, so let's begin. So I've got a few questions for you, Julie, so bear with me. So what is security clearance and why is it needed by business?
So security clearance is a way of determining whether someone could be trustworthy. When I say trustworthy, it's about having the right access to the right information, that's sensitive information. So it's not a standard employee that would have access or have a security clearance. They would have to have access to sensitive information that may be classified as a national security information. Businesses may require it for either their partnerships to work in collaboration with other organisations, or in fact because it's what they do, or to provide services.
Okay, and obviously there are different level of security clearance. There is a security check and then security clearance. Are they the same? Do they mean the same thing, or do they have different meaning?
So they have different meanings, and in terms of a security check, it's to identify potential risks before they become a major problem. So this is really steps that companies can take to protect themselves against fraudulent activity by detecting it early. Whereas the security clearance is really that trustworthy and eligible to have access to information. So they're quite different, but they tend to be lumped together when people talk about, oh, I've had a security check, when actually they mean a clearance. So we need to be really mindful when we're talking about the two, which ones we're actually talking about. So because we're focusing on security clearance today, some of the checks that we've got, and bear with me because I want to make sure I get the terminology correct. So I am gonna look down a fair amount because it's security clearance. There's an awful lot of information, and we want to make sure we get it spot on for you. But the process of obtaining security clearance can include background checks, security questionnaire, criminal record checks. So the old style CRBs, now DBSs, that came into play. It could be a credit reference check and a check of security services, so MI5 records, depending, of course, on the level of that check that you're going to look at. And the time it takes to complete these checks is also going to be completely variant on the complexity of the check that you're going to have. If you think about a DBS check, that can come back quite quickly. But if we're thinking a full-scale security clearance check, that's going to take a bit of time because they need to have time to access all of that information. So it could take up to 9 months, which is an awful long time. So it really depends what clearance you're going for in terms of how long it's going to take to get that check back.
Yeah. And within security clearance, what are the different levels? There are different levels of that check, that clearance, so to speak, which obviously involves, as you said, shorter or longer process.
Yeah, definitely. So we've also got the added twist that if you're a contractor, the time of the check being valid can be completely different as well. So we've got to add in that factor. So the levels of security clearances, we've got accreditation checks, we've got counter-terrorist, we've got security check, enhanced security check, developed vetting, and enhanced developed vetting. So let me just run through those individually because there's a lot. So the accreditation check, now that's normally valid for up to 5 years, depending on if the sponsor of the check keeps up with the updating of data on the check. If they don't, then it could be valid for 12 months. So there we've got a requirement for the sponsor to actually make sure the check is updated regularly, otherwise it will cut short. But accreditation check is normally for individuals who require airport identification cards or UK air carrier crews. So there's a specific group of people that will be appropriate for. The counter-terrorist check, this is reviewed after 10 years or 5 years if it's for a non-facility security clearance contractor. So again, we've got that disparity between the length of time that the check is valid for. Shorter clearances, as I said, can be in play for if we've got subcontractors going through the checks. But also, this is for individuals who are employed to work with public figures who may be at risk of terrorist attacks. So it's not every public figure, but it's for those that identified that they may be subject to terrorist attacks, or be able to give access or material to sensitive information, or are involved in unescorted access to certain establishments. So we can start to see that complexity really starts to drill down when we move into the counter-terrorist check, that instead of it just being for airports, we've actually now got establishments to consider, we've got public figures to consider, and the access of information and materials. Then we move on to the security check. So stay with me. This is normally reviewed after 10 years or 7 years for those non-facility contractors, so your subcontractors. And this is for individuals who have long-term, frequent and uncontrolled access of secret assets or supervised access to top secret assets. So really what information you've got access to depends on this check. It also can be dependent on where the information and the material that the person has access to is coming from. So if it is coming from another country, so it's international, then it could be that is subject to having a security check. It also could be for someone, whether they're employed or not, being able to have the same amount of damage directly or indirectly because they've had access to that information. So a lot of it's about protecting the information that we've got. And that's why these checks tend to be so complex. We then move on to the enhanced security check. So this is the supplementary check to the security check that allows for regular uncontrolled access to top secret of secret assets and occasional controlled access of top secret assets. But this is only to be used for specifically agreed roles. So you're narrowing that catchment of positions that would require an enhanced security check. This is for roles that require access to secret code word materials. So stuff that the majority of us in our lifetime are never going to have access to.
Yeah.
Or they could have access to certain systems that has that information. Then we move on to developed vetting. So this is the top secret. And this is reviewed after 7 years. Again, with the understanding that there may be shorter time periods depending on the role. And this is for individuals who require frequent and uncontrolled access to Category 1 nuclear material. So again, very few people, I imagine, would have this. And again, it talks about whether the same amount of damage could occur, whether you are direct or indirectly involved following seeing that information, and if that information comes from another country.
So I would imagine that this is for, the MI6, MI5 kind of people, I would have thought.
Yeah, and I think those individuals in nuclear power plants, top management,
oh yes, true,
who have that access, I think where we're thinking about supporting roles, they may have a lower down security clearance. And then we've got enhanced developed vetting that I like to think is top secret.
Yeah.
So this is really for a very few people indeed, and very few posts. And to actually get this, you've already got to have a sponsor in place and existing prior agreement with the UK SV, so security vetting, and the Cabinet Office.
Right, okay.
So that's your top dog security clearance. So there's a lot of different options, but also very specific on the types of information that people are going to get access to.
Wow. And I mean, have you ever had any personal experience with any security clearance in your, in your previous life, when you were in HR, working in corporate?
Yeah, completely. So both security clearance and security checks. So with your criminal records. But for security clearance, it was mainly the security clearance level. And this was for engineers who'd have access to sensitive information. Whether that be involved at the recruitment stage of employees coming in, one of the organisations I used to work at, we had secure rooms where people with only security clearance could enter because the information was so sensitive. Yeah. And that was part of the contract that had been agreed with the provider that we were supporting, but also when we won new contracts. So it's not just at the recruitment stage. When we won new contracts into the business and current employees were moving into that, or actually as the contracts come to review, the security clearance comes to review over that 10-year or 7-year period or 5-year period, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
Getting that in place, because of course things can happen in all of our lives that may impact that clearance. Yeah. I think for me, the key to security clearance is the need to be transparent and honest with whatever's happened in your life. It's more about that. It's more about what are you open to? If someone was to bribe you, what would they have on you? Yeah. I've worked with many an individual who's had something happen in their background and has sat down with them and said, look, don't know if you're going to get through this. If you do, great. If you don't, that's fine. If you want to go for it, it would be great if you did. But if you don't, fully understand, because it can trigger some events in people's histories. But actually, because they were honest and transparent, they were security cleared.
Yeah, because it's all about prevention of bribery, isn't it? It's the fact that, if you put it out in the open, then you can't be bribed, isn't it? It's that kind of thinking. Is that, yeah?
Yeah, completely. Yeah. Completely. And what about you, Christina?
And as you were talking about transparency, sort of, thinking, you know what? Transparency is actually, is key to building trust within colleagues, within one organization or another, in any relationship. And funny enough, is also the first principle of the GDPR. So it's just, made me sort of, line the dot, if you want. So in my career, I had to go through security clearance twice for different time for different employers. And although they were private organization, but both of them were working or providing services to the MOD and the MOJ. So in order for me to carry out my role, I had to have access to sensitive information or buildings, section of a building, or the building itself, depending on what it was. So I had to go through that process. And for me, it took a little bit longer because obviously of my dual nationality. So not only they had to do a check in regard to criminal records with the UK, but also with the Italian authorities. And then I remember sort of having to provide the name of my parents and my brother. So they also did a check on them. They sort of had an interview and they were asking me about, sexual habits, sexual preferences, whether I had any violent disputes. It was quite very personal and quite sort of invasive. But, again, like you say, just be transparent, just tell the truth. And why it was uncomfortable, to be honest, I had nothing to hide. But it was also, once I got it and I was then able to do my role, the fact that I had access to that, privilege, if you want, data or area of the buildings, it kind of makes you feel, oh, I'm special. I've gone through the pain. Like, you can't go in there, I can. But no, but you totally, once you, the first time that I had to do it, I couldn't really appreciate it, if you know what I mean. It's only after you're thinking, right, now I get it, why it's important. So when I had to do it the second time, yeah, absolutely, no problem. But yeah, it was quite an experience, I have to say.
I think that is. You get asked, depending on the level of check that you do, you get asked a lot of personal questions.
Yeah.
And whether that be about your sexual preferences, whether that be about your family, your parents, whether your parents have had affairs, things like that, things that actually you may not know, but you need to find the answer to. That can be quite a challenging conversation with the nearest and dearest of, actually, is there something we need to talk about?
Yeah.
But yeah, it definitely can be a tough thing to go through.
Yeah. Yes. But good, it's a good experience. I'm glad I had, the opportunity to go through it.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that for me, so I went through security clearance, but I went through it for a completely different reason. So being the most senior person in HR, when we started putting individuals through security clearance, one of the questions that I wanted answers of is, if you've got access to all the security information, the teams have access, the employees have access. If it was to go through a disciplinary or a grievance or a formal process internally within the business, how on earth does that work? Because it could be some of that information is sensitive. And therefore, how does it work if you don't have access? So one of the things that the organisation agreed to was actually, I would go through security clearance so that it was an escalation point if there was an issue with an employee that was security cleared.
Yeah.
So then this got me thinking of, and Christina, you know how I like to think, that if we get to the point that, let's say we've dismissed someone for security clearance, and it goes to employment tribunal, how does that work? Because an employment tribunal is public forum.
Yeah.
Anyone off the streets can go to an employment tribunal to watch a case, and the judge may not have security clearance, but actually when you're, and this, I suppose this is more for those HR practitioners that are listening, when you're going through this process, actually you can request that a judge has security clearance and it would be a closed court. which is something that in all the years in HR, never heard of, that actually you could request this. It's only if it's security clearance. Of course, the rest of the time it's public.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something to be mindful of. And I think, as we said, the personal data disclosed, even criminal records, whether they are spent, unspent, cautions, convictions, whichever, it's about that trust and honesty. So we need to be able to disclose them in order to get that clearance back. So, Christina, how long can organisations retain the vetting data for?
Okay, so this is where it's really interesting, because it's not GDPR that's sort of coming to force here. It's what is called Part 4 of the Data Protection Act, that basically deals with personal data that is being processed by the intelligence services. When I say intelligence services, they cover security services, secret intelligence services, government communication headquarters, those kind of entities. And what Part 4 of the DPA sort of states is that the controller must actually adhere to 6 principles. And when you look at those principles, actually they are the same as the GDPR principles. So that's where you got the synergy there. So one of those principles is about not retaining the data any longer than necessary. So now, neither the GDPR nor Part 4 of the DPA actually tells you how long that period is. It is for the organizations, whether it's a public or private body, to actually determine that and justify that in their own retention policy. So if you're seeking for a specific timing, specific rule, there isn't one. It's about giving the organization accountability and responsibility for that data. So you need to justify. In some cases, there are some laws that you can apply. For example, financial data, you have to retain it for 7 years, for example. So that is your justification. In some other cases, there isn't a law that you can rely upon, and so you will need to sort of justify, from a business perspective, why do you need to retain that information for X period of time. So really, that's the best that I can tell you.
So what obligations do organisations have?
Okay, so again, this is really interesting, because so the entire UK GDPR will apply to private organisation, but also governmental bodies and vetting agency. So they have to adhere to the GDPR principles. They have to be able to comply with the rights of the data subjects. So these, the rights for access to the obtaining copy of the data, for the right to object, the right to rectification, etc., etc. They also have the obligation to apply security measures to safeguard the data. They still have to notify the ICO within 72 hours if they have a high risk of data breach, etc. There is more obligation, but you get the gist. So everything that it's in the GDPR apply. Now, Part 4 that I mentioned earlier of the Data Protection Act actually grants some exemptions to the security services to safeguard the information for purpose of national security. So if there is the need to safeguard the data because of national security, then the exceptions, if you want, kick in. And this is where it gets really interesting, because actually the 6th principle that I mentioned earlier will just go out the window, except that they still have to have a lawful basis for processing the data. So for collecting and using the data, they still have to have a lawful basis. They no longer have to inform the ICO about data breaches. They also become exempt from monitoring, investigation, and enforcement from the ICO. So, and when it comes to the rights of the individual, so the individual still has the right to be informed. So they need to do that through a privacy notice. So both, so the private or the governmental body or the vetting agency, they still have to provide them with the privacy note to the individual when they collect the data. And the individual still has a right to a copy of their data. But when it comes to having their data rectified or erased, so again, this is in a situation of national security, then the individual has to apply for a court order to actually have the data deleted or rectified. So I thought that is quite interesting, when national security kicks in, how it differs, how it changes. So yes.
Definitely, it's certainly not as straightforward, is it, than just sort of saying I want to be deleted, I want that information gone. I can imagine that applying for a court order to add extra twists and turns when it comes, and especially the delay of what that means for an individual that's requested that as well.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, for if it's not, a national security situation, your rights still apply. So you could ask for the data to be rectified. Say for example, you moved house, you got married, etc. But it's only when there is a national security situation, and you can understand why that is. That more stringent rules apply.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So just to recap, you used the ICO acronym. Can you just expand on the ICO?
So the ICO stands for Information Commissioner Office or Officer. So basically he or she, at the moment it's a he, is the regulator of the GDPR, also of PECA, which is the e-marketing regulation, and also of the Freedom of Information. And so they have the power to issue enforcement, to issue fines, etc. So they are the independent regulator. Obviously, they're a government body. So that's so ICO is short for that.
Thank you. I just thought I'd add that in because obviously we're talking lots of acronyms.
Yes.
Lots of information.
Good catch. Yes.
Yes. It may be sort of like ICO. How does that connect?
Yes. Yeah.
So just to recap, what extent does GDPR apply to the security process, the security clearance process?
So the simple answer really, it's the whole of it, unless, as I said, it's about safeguarding national security. In that case, then the exemptions that I mentioned from the Part 4 of the Data Protection Act will kick in. But otherwise, it's the whole of it. So as I was talking earlier about changes, what happens when an employee leaves to that security clearance?
So this is where employers as well as employees need to be mindful of this. Now, the employer may be working with a sponsor company, so a company that actually is able to sign off on the clearance and put them forward for submission. A lot of organisations can't directly go and say, we want Joe Blogs to have security clearance. They need to find a sponsor to partner with. So normally the employer should contact the sponsor company to say, this person has left the business or is leaving the business. But it is also down to the individual to make them aware. because it's their security clearance. It's not organisation owned. It's for that individual. The individual may be able to transfer their clearance as well if they don't leave it too long, in terms of if you left a job 3 months ago, 6 months ago, you're probably not going to be able to transfer it. Whereas actually, if you do it at the point of leaving a business, you're more than likely able to. Now, of course, you can only transfer it if you're going to work with a business that requires that clearance. So when I was in the corporate world, I had security clearance. I now don't need it. So that's null and void.
Yes. Yes, same here. Yeah, my security clearance was the last one. Yeah.
Yeah, whereas if I was going to work for another organisation that actually needed security clearance, I would have transferred that. Now, it's important to say that actually it doesn't, and this is something, Christina, you mentioned earlier, if an employee changes their address, their life details, etc., they have a responsibility to update the sponsor as part of that, which makes sure that the clearance remains valid. Because, of course, circumstances may change. You've got access to sensitive information. Your life changes, you don't update. Therefore, the security clearance could be null and void, or actually you could put yourself in a vulnerable position.
Yes.
So it's down to the individual. The organisation should also do it as part of their practice. But my recommendation to everyone is you need to own this process.
And also, it's your right. You have the right to have your data rectified. So in this particular instance, you have the obligation, or the organisation put an obligation on you to do that, but you also have the right to do that. So I think it kind of works well together.
Yeah, definitely.
And does the vetting need renewing at some point, or is it valid forever?
Unfortunately, it needs renewing. So as we talked about earlier when we first started, it's going to be for different length of times depending on the security clearance check that you go through. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 7 years, it could be something different if you're a subcontractor.
Yes.
So again, it's really important that as an individual you keep a mind on that, whether that's through a calendar note or whatever way you capture those dates that things are going to expire by.
Yeah.
The process should be a lot quicker going through if your check is still currently in play, because they've got a lot of the information. But it's really going to be dependent on when that check starts, how the organisation handles that check, and of course, if there is a delay in the sponsor or partner processing that check. So I have known security clearance to take 9-12 months. Now, the consideration that you need to have as an individual is that if you're working in a security cleared position and your clearance expires, then theoretically you can no longer do that job because you don't have the right clearance in order to perform the activities. Now, it could be that you get an agreement from the sponsor that actually there's a bridging period of your check's already being renewed, therefore that's absolutely fine. But if it goes over a period of time, it could be actually we need to start talking about whether you can continue to be employed for a role that you simply don't have access to. Yes. And that's where it can get really, really complicated, which is why it's so important that the individual keeps track of expiry dates without terrifying anyone.
Yes.
It's important to be aware of this.
Yeah. And actually that kind of make me think of something else in terms of when an organization brings in a new employee, and obviously, you normally start the vetting process once they are into the organization. And the last organization that I was working for, they did a 1-year probation period, because sometimes it would take up to 12 months for the security clearance to come through. And if it failed, if this, then they couldn't employ them. So they had to have a probation period as long as a year, because of that reason. So yeah, it was quite interesting. So I remember sort of as a manager, I had to think about my recruitment needs like 2 or 3 years in advance, because I had to always consider a 12-month period worth of security clearance that could go either way. So I had to think long term and not short term. So it was quite interesting, yeah.
Definitely. And I think it would be adding to that complexity, because, of course, I always feel like the bearer of good news, is that depending on Labour's plans for employment rights and them giving employment rights from day one, that might have a knock-on effect in terms of security clearance and the rights that individuals have, whether we actually need to look at transferring people into non-security cleared positions or whatever that looks like. I suppose we'll find out more when Labour announce more. But I think from our conversation, yes, it just shows that actually how complex it can really be.
Yes. Yeah.
So, in terms of a question to you, Christina, are you able to divulge that an employee has security clearance and the level of that clearance? Have you had experience of that?
So obviously, as I said, I personally have been security cleared twice because of the roles that I was performing at the time. I also obviously, had a team that had, security had to be security cleared. So obviously, we had to divulge the information to the client who was a government body, because otherwise we couldn't carry out the work. Or we wouldn't be able to have access to certain data or to certain premises, et cetera, et cetera. So it had to be divulged. Per se, the security clearance level and the fact that you are security cleared is not necessarily personal data. So what personal data is data that through which an individual can be identified directly and indirectly. So if say for example that both of us are security cleared, and say we are the top level of secret,
we're going for the great guns.
We're going for the top. Let's pretend we are MI5 or MI6. Unless there is, your name next to that, it's just, do you know what I mean? It's just a kind of a title, I guess. It's not even a title. It's just a label that doesn't necessarily identify you. And also, there might be more than one person with that same label within an organization. So there has to be another element that link that label to you, like a name, for example, or some kind of ID number or employee number or something like that. But just simply divulging that, it's not considered personal data, as I said, unless there is some additional element to it. Yeah,
definitely. I think for me, where I've had it in the past is both through sellers trying to sell a business or a service, but also from customers. So the selling the services that we offer as an organisation, wanting to get hold of who is security cleared within the organisation. So delving into that personal information level to be able to say, if these 6 people work on your account, they've all got this clearance and this is fine, and this is all the information to do. So obviously with adding in that personal information, that's where it starts to go into GDPR and the sensitive information on individuals. But also where people approach customers or future customers who don't require security clearance. So, but want to say, actually, we've got X number of security clearance employees that can work on your service as kind of a value add, which is fine, but equally, is it appropriate? Is it the right level to be able to go out to future customers and say, well, we know you don't have this, but this is something we can offer you? Because that's where the message can get mixed and diluted in terms of that security level clearance or check.
Yeah. Also remember what I said earlier, right, is that you have to have a lawful basis for doing that, for processing that data. So your lawful basis cannot necessarily be, because it's a good marketing, marketing thing to have. That is not, a lawful basis. You will need to sort of, the only one that you could look at would be legitimate interest, but then you have to do an assessment to prove that, your interests, your business interests are higher than the rights of the individual. And, as we said earlier, security clearance can be quite invasive at a personal and private level. So, I would, unless, as I said, you are working with, a government body that requires that, because of the access. If you haven't got that need, you're never going to be able to prove that your business interests are higher than the rights of the individual. So I wouldn't go there. So if you don't need it, and also, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, because the data collected through the process, it's quite sensitive in terms of personal data. Really look at your retention and make sure that you don't hold on it any longer than is necessary. Okay, so so just really look at that, because you're putting yourself as an organization at risk.
Yeah, definitely. It was always very strange to me that people wanted to use it as a value add selling tool than anything else, especially, as we said, the high level of information that you've got to share in order to get the clearance.
Yes.
But whilst finding that with security clearance, we'd also find that with security checks as well, of don't worry, Joe Blogs can do it because they've got this check. Like, well, you're breaching personal data because you're applying a name to it.
Yes. I mean, I work with charities that support children, support, people that have some disabilities, both mental and physical. So, of course, their staff, especially those staff that are working directly with those vulnerable individuals, they have to have a DBS check. And you can see the logic behind that, the need for doing that, the justification for that. But those that work in the office don't need that, and so they're not going to have that DBS check because it's not necessary.
Yeah, completely agree. So in terms of some questions that have come in, we've had one. It's really a comment that we've had come in of someone had their security check done. They were being vetted for a security pass at US Air Force Base, and actually during their security clearance check, they were asked if they ever thought of harming the president of the US.
Wow.
Which is slightly different. Maybe they had, who knows? Who knows? But this is the kind of level that those checks can go into. As I said, I certainly was asked about my parents' relationship, whether they had affairs, whether I had siblings that I weren't aware of, etc. All of that information. In terms of what happens if an employee who's security cleared asks to see their data that's kept on them?
So I mean, you would treat it as a normal subject access request, in terms of you would go through the process and then sort of established whether they've divulging that data to that individual, puts the national security at risk, or any other individual at risk, or the business at risk. So you would look at it from that perspective, and you would then provide what you can and redact anything else. You would apply the same process as you would with any other subject access request that you would receive as part of your normal day-to-day business. So the process would be the same. You just need to be prepared to sort of document. So one of the things that is good about subject access requests is that you should have a register that sort of capture your steps. So you are following the process, but also you're then sort of, if you decide that certain data should not be divulged as part of the request, you need to justify it, because the individuals can then complain and take it to the ICO, to the Information Commissioner Office, and the ICO could then sort of ask you for that justification, and so you need to be at the ready. And so it's important to have a robust process, supported by a register that can be a simple spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be anything complex, but you need to have it. Yes. And another question that came through earlier is, what are the benefits of a security clearance? As a business, why should I do it?
So I think, and as we've alluded to through our time together today, it's about being able to provide services and access information. That is the benefit. If you don't have that security clearance and it's required, you shouldn't have access to that information. As simple as that. I think the challenge for organisations is the complexity of security information, the finding out what is required, how you set it up. I certainly know for me in the past that's been a real challenge of finding sponsors that we can work with and really understanding the process, because it is so secure. They don't want to share necessarily all the if, buts and maybes.
Yeah,
it's much more of a learning as you go, and working with individuals. But yeah, the benefits are really so that you're able to provide that work either as an organisation or as an individual employed. You have access to that information that you need for your role. If you don't need it, if you don't need that access, you simply should not have security clearance.
Yes. And I just saw another question that has come through, and sort of what should an employee do if something happens that might affect the security clearance status? Well, I think we said it, throughout our session. You need to divulge it. You need to tell your employer. You need to be transparent. So going back to the transparency, and honesty. And then, it doesn't necessarily mean that you lose your job, because your employer might be able to relocate you to a role that does not require the security clearance. Or it might be that, if what you think might affect the security clearance, it probably doesn't. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Julie, but I think that's.
Yeah, I think it goes, again, it falls back into that honesty and transparency, doesn't it? Where if you've got an individual who's humming and hawing about something and they haven't checked, there's potentially issue with the transparency. Whereas actually, if it's a phone call to the sponsor, the data protection team, the team that are completing the checks in-house, so it could be HR, it could be data protection team, it could be a compliance team, whoever are doing those, to say, look, this has happened, what do I need to do? You're being transparent, therefore you're being honest. Yes. So it could be that because you've done that, the security clearance is okay.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Now, do we have any other questions, Julie, that have perhaps come through before we close?
Not as yet. What I would say though is, do, if you think of anything, because I think both Christina and I appreciate we've shared lots of information, and lots of complex information as well, that if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out, post them on the LinkedIn page, and we will certainly come back to you.
Yeah. Or also you can message us privately if it's something that it's sensitive. So by all means, do that. You can do that through LinkedIn. So certainly it's we've come to the end of our time together today. You know, as Julie said, please reach out to us if you have any further question, as you start thinking about what, you know, the material that we shared with you, and you can reach out to us at any time, and we will come back to you. Also, please remember to let us know if there is anything that you want us to cover. So just again, send us a question or a comment or a message, because, you know, that will provide us inspiration for new topics. Definitely. We are pleased to let you know that the next LinkedIn Live will be on December the 12th at 10 a.m. And this time we're going to be talking about monitoring and tracking in the workplace. So another very interesting subject, again, dealing with people and data about people. and some things where things have gone wrong. So it's quite an interesting subject. I'm really looking forward to tackling that one. So Julie, thank you ever so much once again for joining me with these LinkedIn Live. I enjoy doing them with you, and I hope our audience enjoy them as well, and sharing our wisdom and our knowledge. So thank you everyone again, and see you next time.
Thanks everyone. Bye.